Hello, and welcome to this session of Human Rights and Human Wrongs. It's great that you could join us with this. We trust that you've started the course well, that you've been able to follow the readings. Sarah and I are delighted to have your company in the general MOOC, but also on these occasions when we get a chance to interact with you a little bit. So I think today's agenda, Sarah, is to talk a little bit about the basic question around human rights, but also to address any questions that might arise that you might have forwarded to us. We have one particular question as well that we've consolidated from other thoughts that have come through on what are human rights. So perhaps we could start, Sarah, with that. Daniel wanted to know, if human rights are what they are meant to be and what we understand them to be, how come it is that violations take place and that these violations
So just
we might start again in case there were people that couldn't hear us. Of course, we have no way of knowing.
Shall we stop?
Yeah. No, don't stop. There.
We're going to just keep playing with the sound.
Let's see if we can get
and
it
we
to
hope
work.
that this is working now. Is it working now? Maybe it's so that's mute, that's unmute.
That's okay now.
That's okay now.
Yeah.
So,
Some of you may not have got the riveting discussion that Sarah and I began. We assumed you were with us. Some of you may well have been with us, but of course,
we don't know.
We don't know, and that's the beauty of this medium. On the one hand, it allows us to speak to all of you on a regular basis. On the other hand, we don't actually know whether you can receive this. So we have been told that you may not have got the first few minutes. So I think we should just start again, Sarah. What do you think?
We should just start again. See if I've got a different opinion.
Let's see if you've got a different opinion. So essentially, I started off by welcoming you. Welcome again if you're hearing this for the first time. It's great that you've joined Sarah and me in this MOOC, Human Rights, Human Wrongs. We're hoping to take you on a journey. We're hoping to be on that journey with you, not just while you watch the videos and engage in the tasks we've set out, but also in these kinds of formats when we can engage directly with you and maybe address questions you have and also learn from you. And I think that's a sentiment that we both share, Sarah. we don't really have this idea that education is something that we cooked up before and that we will slowly and possibly painfully disseminate to you, but rather we genuinely have this belief that we need to learn from each other and we need to understand the challenges you face. And I think especially in the areas that we are interested in, where the received wisdom is all around us, and we need to be able to learn from that received wisdom. So welcome to the course. Apologies if you're being welcomed for the second time. We decided that the place to start was really to ask this question on what are human rights? And that's a little bit prompted by the question that Daniel sent us. And Daniel was concerned about the fact that he said, so there are all these great human rights, but what's the point of them if what you see around you are human rights violations? Not just the drip human rights violations within societies, but then gross human rights violations, and states seem unable to stop that. And I think that was the point, Sarah, at which I asked you for your view on human rights. And of course, you talked about whether human rights were universal or not. So do you want to re-articulate that?
Yeah, I think we start from, my point was that we really need to look back to when human rights as we know them. Now that I'm reiterating, because I've already said this once, I'm refining my argument as I go along here. So if you've heard it once, sorry about that. If you haven't, then it's a better argument, I think.
Good, we should hope so.
So if we look back to when human rights were first defined as we now understand them, then one of the arguments is, one of the critiques is that they were never universal rights. They were rights that came from Western moral values, and then they became rights. And if we do see them in that way, if we do see them as therefore not rights per se, but morals that have been defined as rights in a legal way or through enshrining conventions, then we can understand why they're not universally agreed to, and therefore we can get violations across the globe. But I also think we need to look back on the idea of which rights then have become accepted as human rights, and what role they still have to play in the Western world today, as well as their role or their universality elsewhere.
Yeah. So this was, I mean, one of the, and again, there are lots of strands in that I would agree with. The strand I don't agree with, I guess, is the fact that they are somehow beholden to the Western role in terms of their origin. Because when you look at societies, ancient societies and modern societies, who may not have bought into the human rights the same way that others have, you find that there have been quests in society constantly to try and protect human beings, to try and promote human beings, and to try and devolve systems that can guarantee their inherent dignity and worth. When we look at this from a gendered lens, we often see that that has not been the case with women, because we have often see women are put in a hierarchical position where they are below men, and as a consequences of which any attempt to build a system doesn't address that key fault line, which affects half the population. But in the context of the origins of human rights itself, you will see antecedents in many societies. Yes, it's true that the moral code got translated into a legal code as largely as a result of the events of World War II and the aftermath. So yes, people in Britain, for instance, will talk about the importance of the Magna Carta, and other people will talk about the Code of Hammurabi. But really, the modern international human rights story starts in 1948, and it starts in the aftermath of World War II, when essentially the world gets together in 1945 in San Francisco to start up the United Nations, built on the premise that you need to create an international mechanism that, in the words of the UN Charter, will save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That's the headline news. And the subtext to that is the only way you achieve that is to be able to create a universally oriented system that can protect the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. That's the goal. And that's goal, yes, it starts off in 1945 primarily as a response to what happened in Europe. Because remember, the Holocaust and the atrocities that were perpetrated in the Second World War in Europe were huge, were dreadful. They were not the first. They had occurred elsewhere, but I guess the fact that it happened in Europe captured the imagination of a lot of states, and that led to a response of some kind.
I think I'd like to go back, because you keep using the word protect. Yes, originally the notion was to protect, but do you really think that that's what rights are about or are being used for at the moment? Do you see this protection as being the main thing? Because when I think about rights, I don't really think about them as protecting human beings, particularly women. I see them more as sort of being used to promote certain aspects, but the protection aspect in terms of the inherent dignity of human beings, I don't know that that is how human rights are now being used.
Okay, so my answer to that is yes, they are being used to promote as well and to protect as well. But if you look at the genesis of the human rights story from 1945 to 1948, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says very clearly that human rights are indivisible and they should be used to both protect and promote. So in the I guess in the morass of what is human rights, it's very clear, protect and promote. But then when you look at practice from 1948 onwards, you see that human rights are used much more to protect than to promote, ironically. So you have a feeling by which human rights are seen as civil and political, and those are protection-oriented rights. So you protect somebody's right to life. You protect somebody's rights against slavery. You protect somebody from genocide, crimes against humanity. And many argued, especially in the developing world, said, look, that's all fine, but you can't eat the right to vote. That actually promotion-oriented rights are more important. And so there was almost a bifurcation in the human rights agenda by which some believed that the only important thing was protection and the story should end there. And others who said protection should be taken for granted. It's promotion you need to worry about. That actually, when you look at the condition of somebody who is hungry in South Sudan, possibly what you need is much more promotion-oriented than protection-oriented. But as when you compare that with the child in Sweden, possibly what you need is more protection-oriented to safeguard the rights they already have. They don't need to be promoted. They need to protect what they already have. So I think a part of this is depending on where your starting point is. And I think from a gendered starting point, I would agree promotion of rights is probably is important, but protection can't be forgotten about.
Yeah, but if you talk about protecting the right to life, and if we look at femicide across the globe, we look at violence against women across the globe, then that protection, that right has never been fundamentally realized at all across anywhere. So that we're back to this notion of then when is a right really a right?
Yeah.
And if we see violations of rights, then in part it's because they're not accepted as rights, not just because they're not being protected or you're not being promoted, but inherently people don't necessarily see them as rights.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I would disagree with that because I would say that the legal systems in the world now officially recognize them. So how do I put it? Just because all societies have laws against theft, but theft occurs. Just because theft occurs doesn't mean there isn't a law. Just because theft occurs and the person who's perpetrating the theft gets away with it, still doesn't mean that there aren't any laws. It means the laws are ineffective. So if you are engaging me on the question that human rights are ineffective, I absolutely 100% agree with you. They have been ineffective. But if you say there aren't human rights because people don't know they are, well, then I think one of the jobs is to make sure people do know their human rights and to engage that activism to be able to get those human rights realized. So human rights are not something that a government holds that you have to, that the government will then hand out to you. Human rights are almost something that the government has agreed to, that you have to, through action, take, because they are owed to you. So a lot of this becomes about the extent to which you have access to human rights, and that access is meaningful enough to first give you the rights that we say are yours on paper. The other is to create the system that will make sure that everybody will always, in the situation you are in, be able to access it. So it's an access question, not an existence question.
I agree with that, and I don't have a problem with that, but I think you need to go one step further back than that, and I think you already touched on that, is access only comes if you even have knowledge that.
Absolutely.
And to have knowledge that you have a right, obviously if you are oppressed, it's more difficult to have knowledge of your own oppression because you're oppressed.
Yes.
So then we have that circular issue of then how can you actually put rights into practice if rights aren't known, because rights can't be in practice if they're not known and no one can actually demand their rights. And if you're looking at the rights of the oppressed, if the oppressed are oppressed, how can they know their own oppression? Then where do rights come in then?
So for me, the answer to that is really straightforward. The rights come in by, first of all, engaging directly with communities that are far from sites of power, explaining it to them, listening to them, because some of the rights are badly configured to their needs. So changing those that need to be configured to their needs. So treating the people who are far from sites of power as subjects of law and not objects of law. And I make that distinction a lot. I think even in various different places in this course, you'll hear me say that. There's a distinction between a subject and an object in law. A subject of law is one whose consent is required. An object of law, you don't require consent. And I think very often what you find that there are groups of people, groups of human beings across the world. And again, you could argue women as a category perhaps fit into this as well as any other in certain circumstances. But there are groups of people who are so far from sites of power that they have no way of accessing it. Then for me, law treats them as objects and not as subjects. So to go back to the point, I would say the process has to start by which everybody across the globe understands what they are entitled to, because this is about entitlements now. Then perhaps the way in which the entitlement is phrased is wrong, and that needs to change. Fine, that's that dialogue at which the system learns from the victim and understands why the system is not configured well enough to address the victimhood. So that's one level of dialogue that has to take place. But the next level of dialogue that has to take place is the empowerment, either the self-empowerment or the empowerment through others, of a process of articulation to gain those entitlements which society have in a social contract sense promised all citizens. So yes, if you don't have that first step, human rights are in many societies largely meaningless. I agree. But the quest has to be to try and make human beings aware of it so they can articulate it. Because I don't see another credible alternative. If we were in utopia and we could reconstruct society, I would reconstruct it without the gender divide. I would reconstruct it without the power divide. But how else do you tackle those divides?
But I think one of the issues is this time you've kept using the word power. And I think when I read the old documents around rights, or a lot of documents around rights, the issue of power is not what's articulated there. And the imbalances of power and inequality of power and those power relations are not what's fundamentally being addressed or attacked. And therefore, we can talk about rights, and you can say, oh, we need, those with power, or people need power, or indeed empowerment, which is a term that I don't like very much. I prefer to think about lack of power than empowerment, because it's a very vague term.
No, I think that's.
But I think for me, missing in the rights discourse, or many rights discourses, is the issue of power.
Yeah.
And unless we address power, unless we fundamentally address it head on, and inequalities of power, and speak about them as they are, and speak about the structural causes of them, then we don't get anywhere. And I find that sometimes the rights discourse, just by not mentioning power, it just glosses over all that. And I know you don't do that, and that's not what I think, but I think a lot of the rights discourse does do that.
No, and I accept that. And I mean, in English, we use this term, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I mean, absolutely, there are problems with the discourse, which is always a bizarre term, because bathwater gets thrown out quite often, babies and all. So there is absolutely, there are problems with the discourse, but I don't think the problems with the discourse are necessarily reflective of what it is that human rights can offer society. So there's a difference between what can be, what ought to be, and what is. I am not questioning that at all. I think, in a sense, you have to be able to take that head on, understand that law, especially as a tool, has always been a tool constructed by the powerful to promote the interests of the powerful. There has always been this tension in law between the need to promote order and the need to ensure that that order is just. And that has always been a tension. If you look at the earliest laws ever, you will see that the earliest laws were about property, and those laws were not about sharing property. The contrary, they were to safeguard the property the powerful had from other claimants. So if anything, law was set up as a tool to protect the interests of the powerful, and guess who made the laws? The powerful made the laws. So without a doubt,
which powerful made the laws?
The men.
The men.
I get my students to do this. Absolutely.
Right,
I get my students to try and imagine that first, that celebrated Athenian democracy, and to ask that question of who do you think were the people in that celebrated Athenian democracy? They were men, first of all, every one of them. And they were men who owned property. So without a doubt, that the tools of the trade that we have here, and which human rights falls in that tool of the trade, without a doubt, this has fallen into the trade or trade craft of those with power who make the rules to protect their interests. But for me, human rights is a departure point. For me, human rights is the point at which it says, now, fine, order, yes, but just an order. And justice is as important as order. Sometimes justice may even be more important than order. So it may well be that you need chaos, and that it may well be that an order that's unjust needs to be broken down till you have an order that's just. And I think human rights can play a role in it. And the activism of people around the world has played that role. Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, all of these people in different ways have used the rhetoric and the narrative of human rights to bring people to that table, to bring people to articulate those rights in a way that has had real social change.
But the question is, can a regime that was born out of patriarchal control lead to real change, when it's born out of those with power, in essence protecting their own power, as well as saying they'll protect other people to maintain their power, then can it actually bring fundamental change?
For me, look, if the answer to that question is no, then I would ask myself the question of, so why then do anything about it other than shout yourself hoarse about how terrible it is? And I'm not saying there isn't room for protest. I think protest is important. But I think you have to engage the tools that exist to change systems. That is my fervent belief. That's why I work in this particular field, because I think ultimately you do, in the words of Virginia O'Leary, you do try and speak truth to power. I mean, you do try and do that. You say, I didn't design the human rights systems. I didn't say as a state, men and women will be treated equally. I didn't say that. You said that as a state. Power spoke, and power, either because it was coerced or not, or because it felt there were good trade benefits to get from it, said men and women are equal, and we will protect the inherent dignity of worth of everyone. That's what the state systems are saying. Power said that. All I'm saying is, look, you've said it, I'm trying to make it real. So I will use the tools that exist, that you have designed, to try and use that to be able to make that rhetoric a reality. And I think human rights can do that. Of course, you could make the argument that there is no point, because ultimately protest is the only way and critique is the only way. And people subscribe to that view, and I think that that's a valid view. I think it's a question of, so what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that we agree on the diagnosis of the problem, but perhaps where we disagree, and I'm not sure that we do disagree, because you're actually in a course called Human Rights and Human Wrongs. So obviously, you do. She might be well subverting this, absolutely. And believe
feminist.
me, Sarah is known to have done that on many different occasions. So it wouldn't surprise me, and certainly as you get to know Sarah through this process, it probably won't surprise you that she might well be doing this. But I think in genuine essence, if you don't mobilize people to think solutions, to think about how tools that have been designed can be used to achieve what the tools say they're designing, irrespective of where they came from. So absolutely recognize the patriarchal ownership that sets this down, but it is there, it's a fact, it can't be changed, we can't go and rebirth it. So we now need to understand, where do we go from here? And for me, what human rights does is it says there is a particular avenue that can be followed. Without a doubt, it's a flawed avenue. Without a doubt, the discourse is terrible. It doesn't talk enough about power, because a lot of the people who engage in it are powerful themselves, without a doubt. But if we can disseminate that power and break down that power and get a different kind of power matrix there, we can get real change. I really do genuinely believe we can get real change through that particular process. And I think that's what links in to the Sustainable Development Goals, because I don't see how imagining a world in 2030 or a world in 2050 without putting human beings at the center of it and understanding the need to promote the inherent dignity and worth of every individual can give you a world in 2030 or 2050 or beyond that is sustainable. Because if we take into account the climate change science that exists, we will know that there is likely to be a race to the bottom in terms of who has access to resources and who doesn't. So you can well imagine a scenario by which, as oceans dry up and as commodities get scarce, there will be a bidding up for the commodities, and that the power matrix will determine who gets them. If you don't challenge that early enough and start imagining a different world now in 2017, and some would argue it's already late, you're not going to be able to imagine a different world. And I think one of the problems is that we often assume that the future will resemble the past, and as a consequence, it usually does. We have to design it differently. So
I think that, I think we agree on many points, but I think fundamentally for me, we have to question the discourse of rights, and we have to fundamentally question it from its origins and how it's used now and how it's being used, and that the term can be used basically to deny people's rights as much as to ensure people's rights. And just by talking about someone has rights, then we often don't have the conversations about what that means or what that would mean for our society. And I think that ties in very nicely with a question we've just been handed by Rebecca, who's staying off screen.
Indeed.
But is helping us over there. And the question is around the UK lobbying for trans rights and the idea of where trans rights would fit within human rights. And I think what's interesting about this question, from what we've been saying, is very much around, it shows how rights can evolve and can change. But it also shows how a group, it's not that this group of trans people are new, it's that suddenly now it's like, oh, they should have their rights protected. And so we can see that rights then are inherently flawed in terms of what they do and what therefore they don't do. And one of my issues with rights is when we talk about rights that are established. And we don't talk about those non-rights that for many groups and many people should be rights, but aren't rights. And therefore, that's why I have a bit of a problem with the limitations of the rights discourse. It often keeps us to what is known and what is established and what is agreed. Well, agreed in inverted commas, because even some of those rights aren't agreed because they're not lived. But then we have all these other rights that, because they're not called rights, then what are they? And I think that's, so I think the question ties back to what we're talking about.
No, it does. The question does tie, and thank you, Vinny, for that question. I mean, in a sense, there are a few elements to the question. So the question, just to read it out, is the UK is lobbying for trans rights to be included in a UN treaty. Are trans rights a new necessity in human rights? There are a number of aspects there. First of all, just let's remember, at the heart of it, a lot of these things are perception oriented. So there are cultural issues there. There are a whole series of other issues. But let's just focus on one aspect. Human rights, if there's one thing you take away from this, I would like it to be the fact that human rights are a mechanism through which you promote the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. Add an equality to that, the equal and inherent dignity and worth of every human being. So if something is getting in the way of you enjoying on an equal footing the inherent dignity and worth of your own being, then it's a problem that needs to be fixed. Then we can argue as to whether it's more important than poverty eradication, it's more important than climate change, where does it sit in the pantheon of rights between the right to life and the right to education. Sure, we can locate it, and who you are and what your experience is will determine how much value you give to it. If you live in a society where there is no hunger, you'll say, well, hunger is not a priority because all the citizens in your state have access to food. If, on the other hand, you live in a society where there's no freedom of expression, you may well decide that that's the issue that's of fundamental importance. Just, is it a new right? Perhaps it is a new right. It's a new articulation of a right. Is it the most important right? If you are in the position where that is the key issue that's affecting your inherent dignity and worth, it is the most important right to you, because nothing else, everything else that you may or may not enjoy flows from how you are labeled. And if you are labeled in such a way that you're exempted from different rights, it's a problem. If, and that's also, we have evidence for that, if you can get killed for it, it violates your right to life. So it's interconnected in many different ways. Lobbying for a UN treaty, what's the worth and value of that? Again, this is where I would agree with you, Sarah, that essentially there are a bunch of treaties. They are extremely expensive in terms of time to create. And then to go back to the first question that Daniel raised with us, saying, well, all these treaties exist, rights exist, they get violated, so what? So you have to do a cost-benefit analysis whether a UN treaty is the route to go. Where very often the articulation of standards mobilizes a lot of people, and I would say distracts a lot of people. And those people, instead of being able to articulate the rights in their own circumstance, are now all flying to Geneva and New York to agree the subtext and the sub-articles of a treaty. That treaty is then going to be signed and ratified, we hope, because many treaties don't get signed and ratified. We then hope that the treaty that emerges from that very expensive, long, time-consuming process will be signed and ratified by states who will make the promise, by the way, that those rights will be accessible to all their citizens. Then that may or may not happen. Then even if it does happen, it's a long route, in other words, to realize rights. And I agree on that sense, that human rights sometimes in the legalistic, formulaic UN speak can be a very, very long process through which to change society. At the same time, in the words of Marty Koskaniemi, who's an international lawyer, he argues that international law is a gentle civilizer, that ultimately, as you progress, you put down a line in the sand and you say, this is the point at which we will not drop below. And the argument that he makes is, we did that with genocide, we did that with slavery. We've kind of always played lip service to the fact that we've done it on gender equality. I think evidence will suggest to the contrary. But as a norm, it's established. In reality, it's far from being established. So in a sense, this is a process by which we have to continue to progress, if you like. And to that extent, recognition of trans rights is a sign of that progress, in that you're tackling something that gets in the way of an individual who's not being able to realize their inherent dignity and worth.
So I think trans rights comes down to a fundamental issue around identity. and the right to your own identity. And therefore, yes, it's enshrined within our rights, but it's not actually, again, spoken about this notion of the right to be who you are, the right to be as you want to be.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's in the notion of the dignity and the rights, but if it's not articulated, it's assumed to be something that we all know.
Yeah.
And in the world of binaries in terms of gender, then male, female, right to be a man, right to be a woman. And then this fluidity then, this identity, this fluidity of identity then is really important because it's respecting everybody's right to their own identity, which isn't a right that's in established anywhere as a right as such. And therefore, for me, this idea about these trans rights are new necessity and human rights, I think it's not. I think it's about gendered identities and about respect of those. And yes, rights are important for respecting those, but we're back to the notion of that doesn't mean anything unless there's a change in attitudes, unless society respects those, as they're accepted.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it's really important, but it's acceptance of other people's identities and to be who they are and what they are.
Yeah.
And I don't know that comes from the rights framework.
No, I don't know that it does, but I don't know, in a sense, the rights framework.
Obviously, it's really important to have those rights there.
And that's what I was going to say. You know, and essentially,
don't get me wrong.
So, you know, I in my role hear a lot of criticism about the UN, and people will say the UN is like this or the UN is like that. Yes, it is probably all those things and worse, because there's probably things you don't know about the UN that will give you even bigger cause for worry than the things you do know. But the fact is that...
Talk about those?
Oh, we couldn't we? That would be fun. But the fact is that, in a sense, we need to understand the role that we play as agents. We need to understand the extent to which these things concern us, and we need to understand what it is that we can do in how we look at this. We need to get away from withering critique. That, you know, I think it's easy. Withering critique is easy. We can sit in an armchair and we can pillory people and we can consider them to be less human because they make strange decisions and they say silly things on Twitter. You know what I'm talking about? You know, we can pillory all of that.
I don't know who you are.
Well, you know, a certain person in power in a certain country that shall remain unnamed, called the United States of America. But essentially, it's easy to critique. It's easy. We need to get away from that. We need to get away from that critique to genuinely reach out and build constituencies, because the future is not going to be won by us infighting. The future is going for us to be won through pragmatic realism. We need to understand the value of engagement. And I think sometimes the critique is an easy way to avoid doing something about it, because look, I'm so vocal, I can criticize. I'm not saying there isn't a role for it. Critique has got us important progress in society, but we need to sometimes step beyond that into the collaborative, into trying to collaborate and trying to construct new realities.
I absolutely agree with that, but I think the critique of ourselves also, I don't think just think the critique on the general level, but to think about how we see rights. And I think this is a fundamental issue with rights. Often there seem to be out there something that's there that's nothing to do with us on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I don't normally sit on a bus coming into work thinking about my rights, or my rights being fulfilled at this precise moment, and which rights are not being fulfilled, and which rights are under threat. But you don't think about it in that way. And I think that we need to try and think of a way of translating those rights that we know in the legal sense into everyday life, and then people to critique their own behaviour around those rights and how they are implicated within the fulfillment of their own rights and other people's rights, or not fulfilling other people's rights, where we fit within that chain. I think that's something that we're not doing.
No, I agree.
And I think critique has a really important role to play in that, so that different groups can say, look, this right is not helping me because of these reasons, and then other people listen and think, well, where do I fit within that? Not just governments, not just states, but individuals on a basis, because we all interact with each other's rights, even though we don't think about it. When we buy things, you know, we know about, you know, bad labour practices in other countries from our own, where we buy our clothes from, and we know we're violating those rights, and we do it. And we might think, oh no, I'm violating someone's right on a momentary basis, and we might join a campaign against it. So that critique is important to think about where ourselves are and what rights mean.
Critique to spur action. Critique to spur action, yes. Critique as an end game, for me, has limited value. But critique to spur action, but it's fun for some. But by the way, I mean, you know, again, you don't think about rights on your bus ride in. I think about rights on my cycle ride in. I do think about it. I do think about the fact that Rohingya, as we speak, essentially facing the kind of thing that we talked about in 1945 would never happen again, a scourge of warfare. So I do think about the extent to which we have systems and societies that are distracted. Sarah and I are living in a society at the moment that's completely distracted by Brexit. And as that's the only game in town, and that's the only important thing that's worth thinking about. And there are lots of violations that are taking place across the board here in the UK and abroad, which are not being tackled, and there seems to be little airtime for them. And I think that's partly our own navel gazing and the extent to which we in our own societies get so ingrained in what we think is the only important thing to us that we can't feel that sense of solidarity towards other people in struggle. But we're surprised by it when it happens to ourselves. If there's a terror attack, we are surprised that if we are victims of a terror attack, that not the whole world isn't engaged with that. Because when you're a victim, you are focused on your victimhood. We need to build a sense of solidarity by which an attack against one is an attack against all. We need to understand how to construct a society where we feel that sense of empathy and we feel that sense of redesigning systems that we'll never get away from power, I guess, but that they get power to understand realities.
But I agree with that. And when I was saying me sitting on my bus, I'm not thinking about my individual rights.
No, I know.
I will be thinking about other people's rights, but I don't necessarily then think about how my bus ride interconnects with their rights. So I think that's what I'm getting at. Then I will abstractly be thinking about other people's rights because that's what we do. That's partly our job, and that's what we do. But then thinking about how that then connects back to my bus journey, I don't make those connections. I don't sit and fundamentally think, well, where do I fit within this? And where does Michael necessarily fit within this? And I don't think we draw those day-to-day links, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really important that we all try and do that.
And I think that's what we're trying to do through this course, because one of the things we want to do in this course is to give you exposure to many different situations across the world. It's not done with a view to just critique. We're looking at good practice. We're looking at issues. We're looking at how women and men all across the world are engaging with this agenda and making change. Some of them are doing it because they wholeheartedly believe and they have a conviction. Some of them are doing it as pure problem solving. Pragmatic problem solving. Others are doing it for other reasons. Some are doing it because they themselves want power and they are seeing this as a mechanism through which they can seize power. We don't necessarily want to promote that. At the same time, if that quest achieves a more just society, well, sign me up. I think that's one of the, so there are many different elements and aspects we look through. And I think this is one of the reasons why I would argue that on the human rights agenda, see, in the human rights world, we've been spending a lot of time in trying to understand what human rights are. I think that's a dead end. We need to understand who they are for. And I think the approach that we are taking in this course is by looking at human rights through the lens of women and through the lens of groups far from sites of power, we are trying to show you where those gaps lie, but also what are the tools that can be used to try to bridge those particular gaps. And I think that's a key ethos to many of the sessions that we do. Tony has also sent a question, which is an intriguing one, Tony. So Tony says, since origins of human rights are in all of our cultures, should we call them human rules? Tony's clearly been listening, but I don't know if he listened to the first 3 or 4 minutes without the sound, or whether he listened to the second 3 or 4 minutes. So thank you, Tony, for that question. And I guess this is a reference to the fact that we talk about human rights existing in all these different cultures. Should we call them human rules? What do you think, Sarah? Human rules, will that convince you a little bit more than human rights?
No.
No, why not?
I don't know. Rules are made for breaking, aren't they? And a lot of people see it. I'm telling you,
these rebellious people who inhabit the world we live in.
It comes down to, if we change the word, do we change the discourse around the word? Do we change the way that it's understood? And if it doesn't change fundamentally how it's understood, then it's not going to make a lot of difference. I can see where the question's coming from.
Yeah,
it's the idea, if we
that.
call it rules, does it make it more enforceable?
Yeah.
And if we call it rights, because obviously rights are an improvement on needs. So you've got your needs and then you've got your rights. And then if you have rules, would that mean everyone would have to then actually uphold the rights that underpin the rules?
Yeah.
But then, I mean, I said jokingly rules are made for breaking, but we know that that's what people do all the time. Yeah. So I can absolutely see where it's coming from. Do I think it would make a difference? Firstly, I'm not sure the change of word would. Secondly, I think people would still find ways around it. And thirdly, it begs the question, who's going to enforce these rules?
Yeah.
If the minute we're not enforcing rights, if we call them rules, first of all, you'd have to get all governments to agree these are the universal rules, which we've had a hard time enough getting to agree with human rights. So it's an intriguing question.
It is an intriguing
question. From a legal
question.
perspective?
Yeah, it's an intriguing question because from a legal perspective, especially so, Tony, because rights versus rules, let's put it this way. If I got to design the rules today and I got to impose those rules on people, and those rules took as a basic starting point inherent dignity and worth of every individual, actively sought to undermine a patriarchy-based system, actively sought to promote the rights of groups far from power, well, I'll be very happy to call them rules. But that's my perspective. That's not the perspective of everybody. In fact, that's probably an alternative perspective. And I think that's a key issue there. So I guess what that gets down to is if we call them rules, I would be worried about who makes them. And we're back into the matrix again of power. And looking at the world at the moment and the 194 sovereign states and UN leadership and how far civil society is from sites of power, I would be really worried about calling them rules because I don't think they would necessarily improve what we have. So I said to you earlier in this session, and I think I'm afraid I've said it plenty of times, and I will say it plenty of times. So you can hold me to that particular promise or threat. Rights have been made, laws have been made by the powerful, laws have been used by the powerful to promote the interests of the powerful. Rights are something of a subverting mission in the creation of those powers. For me anyway, I think rights have the potential to subvert that power. Rules perhaps have less of the power to less of the energy to subvert that power, because rules inevitably are enforced through power. And this is the difficulty, and I think this goes back to Daniel's original question as well. Let's say we do have a human rights world, a world where the human rights are not only central to the way in which states operate, but are imposed and implemented and upheld. Who would be doing that enforcement, upholding? Inevitably, it would be the people who have the power. If they act with power to promote their own interests, then that's going to be their central raison d'etre, not the rules themselves. And that's my concern. And I think that's also why the fact that gross human rights violations occur and go unchecked, that's also the fact that the people in power who can make a difference are just not concerned about it enough. And I think the role of civil society here, and the role of you as a participant who's interested in this, and us as people who are working in the field, and others who are perhaps not signed up, please do get them to sign up, it is important. And others who are interested in that space need to understand what is in that space, how that space can be used, and how that space can genuinely contribute to upholding systems that protect the inherent dignity and worth of all, because the systems exist. The systems have never really been implemented in a meaningful way. And that's our challenge. And I think that challenge will give us a more secure future than anything else. So, do you agree?
I agree. We need to put power central, and we need to question power.
Well,
as our
that
central
we will be
question
doing.
Is questioning power.
If there's an off moment when I fail to do it, Sarah will be doing it. So we will be questioning that a lot. But we also hope that through this course, you'll have an opportunity to engage with some of the debates that we do. We will agree and disagree. And I think part of it is just that we enjoy this subject. We hope that you will enjoy the subject. But we want to learn from you. So please do send us questions. Please do send us situations that you are aware of. Please do send us reading material. We want this to be a safe space in a sense. It's hard to talk about a safe space when it's across time zones and across many different cultural settings. But we will give you views. Our views are our views. These views may offend you. We would love to hear if they do. You can take for granted that we don't set out trying to offend you. But some of these questions are hard questions, and there aren't really easy answers to us. I often joke with people, and I think part of the politics we're seeing at this point in time is all about the politics of simplicity. So we seem to think that there are complex problems there, but why not elect somebody who will, I don't know, get rid of migrants, break away from an organization, and peace and harmony will automatically break out. So we seem to think that there are simple answers to complex questions, when it's actually the reality is complex answers need nuanced and complex solutions. And actually solutions in one setting might not work in another setting. I think the beauty of this particular medium, with all of you in these different time zones who've signed up, and thank you for doing that, is that we will get a chance to engage with you, hear your perspective. There's only so much you can get out of Sarah and me speaking to you in these fora. You already have that opportunity when you listen to us, and sometimes it might be tedious. I certainly don't like listening to myself. I think Sarah's stuff, by the way, is great.
I think your stuff is
great. Good. So you can see we formed a mutual admiration club here. So at least we're okay on that, yeah. But it would be useful to hear from you, I think. And I think that's what these Google Hangout sessions are mainly designed to do. From time to time, we'll try and bring others in, just to give you other perspectives, because you've got our perspectives. And we'll welcome suggestions from you about topics, issues you think you'd want to see discussed, and your own views. So I think with that, I would like to bring the session to a close. Sarah, thank you very much. It's been fun. It's good to start this process again for a second time.
Yes.
We look forward to engaging more with you. Thank you for signing up. Please do keep watching, and please do keep engaging with the reading. Again, what we say to you is just a tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of material out there, and we hope to enthuse you enough to go out there and find it yourself.
Go read.
It's been a pleasure being with you. Good luck until next time. Best of luck. Bye.